Pinocchio is often remembered as a story about honesty, a simple moral tale where lying is punished and truth is rewarded. But before it becomes a lesson, it functions as something quieter. It observes how language behaves before values fully form. Pinocchio does not begin as a liar in the strategic sense. He does not set out to deceive in order to gain power or advantage. He lies because he has entered a world where words have consequences he does not yet understand. Speech appears to him as expressive rather than binding, something that can be adjusted, revised, or abandoned without lasting effect. In this early stage, language feels light. It responds to the moment rather than shaping the future. Words are used to escape discomfort, delay correction, or soften reactions. The assumption is not that truth matters less, but that it is optional, one way of speaking among others. Truth here is not a value, it is a condition that has not yet been tested. The world Pinocchio enters does not immediately correct this assumption. Consequences appear inconsistent. Authority hesitates. Adults respond to explanations. The environment itself seems flexible. This reinforces the idea that reality can be negotiated through speech. The story at this point is not about right and wrong. It is about orientation, about how a character learns what language does when it moves beyond expression and begins to accumulate weight. Pinocchio's early lies are not framed as moral failures. They are framed as attempts to adapt. Each one is a response to pressure rather than a plan to dominate. The goal is relief, not control. What the story begins to observe is not dishonesty, but a misunderstanding, a mismatch between how language is used and how it functions over time. That mismatch does not correct itself immediately. It unfolds. Pinocchio's behavior follows a consistent internal logic, even before the story names it. He operates under the assumption that situations can be corrected after they arise, that mistakes are temporary, that explanations can reshape outcomes if delivered quickly enough. Under this strategy, consequences are not denied, they are deferred. Language is used to manage discomfort rather than prevent it. When pressure appears, speech follows immediately, not as a considered choice, but as a reflex. This creates a particular relationship to truth. Truth is not rejected, but it is not prioritized. It competes with other options. Silence, exaggeration, omission, or invention all feel equally available. The criterion is not accuracy, but effectiveness in the moment. The strategy is reactive rather than deliberate. Pinocchio does not lie in advance. He lies when the situation tightens. Each response is shaped by what feels necessary to restore balance quickly. This approach treats information as fluid. Words are expected to adjust to circumstances, not fix them. Once the pressure passes, the speech that produced relief is assumed to dissolve with it. The past is not expected to persist. Importantly, this strategy does not feel risky to Pinocchio. The environment has not yet taught him otherwise. Adults hesitate, authority listens, corrections are inconsistent. There is no immediate pattern linking speech to lasting consequence. Because of this, the strategy feels efficient. It requires little planning, it demands no long-term memory, it allows movement to continue uninterrupted. What Pinocchio does not yet perceive is that the strategy works only because the system has not begun to account for accumulation. Each lie is treated as a discrete event. There is no sense that they might begin to relate to one another. The original strategy depends on a world that resets quickly, where moments do not stack, where explanation outruns memory. For a time, that world appears to exist. At first, the strategy works. Pinocchio discovers that speech can interrupt consequence, that explanations soften reactions, that discomfort can be redirected rather than absorbed. Each lie creates a small pocket of relief, a pause in which pressure dissolves instead of landing. This success is important. It is not abstract, it is experiential. The world responds. Adults hesitate. Authority slows. The immediate environment appears to negotiate. This teaches Pinocchio something specific long before any moral lesson is introduced. Outcomes are flexible. Under these conditions, truth begins to feel inefficient. It offers clarity but not relief. It produces resolution but also finality. Lying, by contrast, keeps situations open. It stretches time. It delays closure. This is not a moral calculation. It is a practical one. The strategy feels adaptive because it produces movement. Pinocchio remains mobile. He avoids being fixed in place by consequence. Each successful lie reinforces the association between speech and freedom. Importantly, the strategy does not yet require planning. It remains improvisational. Lies emerge in response to pressure, not in anticipation of it. The cost is low. The environment absorbs the distortion. From a strategic perspective, this is the most dangerous moment. Not because harm occurs, but because feedback is positive. The system rewards behavior that will later become unstable. The success is local, not structural. It solves immediate problems while quietly reshaping expectations. Others begin to respond not only to what Pinocchio says, but to the fact that he speaks when pressure appears. At this stage, nothing feels compromised. There is no visible erosion of trust, no lasting penalty. The strategy appears clean. Lying does not yet feel like deception. It feels like competence. What remains unseen is that each successful interruption trains the environment to listen differently the next time. The strategy works because the system has not yet adjusted. That adjustment is coming. The relief produced by lying does not reset the system. It accumulates strain. Each lie resolves a local problem while quietly increasing global instability. Explanations become more frequent. Stories grow longer. The effort required to maintain coherence increases, even as flexibility decreases. Pinocchio begins to notice repetition. The same conflicts return. The same explanations are required again. What once felt like improvisation begins to resemble maintenance. This is the first structural change. The environment stops responding with surprise. Skepticism replaces confusion. Questions arrive earlier. Reactions harden. The cost of being believed rises. Words must work harder to produce the same effect. Lying becomes labor. Pinocchio is no longer responding to isolated situations. He is managing a pattern. Each new explanation must account not only for the present, but for what has already been said. Memory enters the system. This alters the rhythm of interaction. Conversations slow, clarifications multiply. Speech that once flowed freely now carries friction. Importantly, this shift does not arrive as punishment. There is no single moment of exposure. Trust does not collapse. It thins. Credibility does not vanish, it erodes. The consequences are cumulative rather than dramatic. Pinocchio may still succeed in the moment. Lies may still produce relief, but each success now leaves residue. Something remains after the pressure passes. The strategy continues to function, but at increasing cost. What was once effortless now requires attention. What was once invisible begins to announce itself. The system has started to remember. This is the point where lying stops being a series of events and begins to form a structure. Not yet a trap, but no longer an escape. The balance is shifting. At a certain point, lying stops functioning as a way out. It no longer dissolves pressure. It reorganizes it. Pinocchio begins to sense that each lie now changes the terrain rather than the moment. What once allowed him to move freely now fixes his position more firmly. Explanations linger. Stories must be remembered. Contradictions accumulate. The strategy has crossed a threshold. What changes is not the frequency of consequence, but its form. Lying no longer delays correction. It shapes expectation. Others begin to anticipate distortion before it occurs. Suspicion arrives earlier. Doubt precedes explanation. The space where improvisation once worked narrows. This is the structural shift. Words, once used to smooth interaction, begin to harden into architecture. Each explanation becomes a support that must align with the next. One inconsistency threatens several others. The system becomes brittle. Pinocchio is no longer choosing lies freely. He is maintaining a structure built from them. The strategy now requires planning, memory, and constant adjustment. Silence becomes risky. Speech becomes costly. What once felt flexible now feels binding. Importantly, this shift does not produce immediate collapse. The structure holds. That is what makes it dangerous. It stabilizes around limitation. The cost is paid gradually through attention and restraint. Power at this stage appears present but feels hollow. Pinocchio can still influence reactions, but he can no longer shape outcomes freely. Control becomes maintenance. Effort replaces ease. He is no longer acting primarily in response to the present. He is managing the accumulated consequences of the past. Lying has not failed catastrophically. It has succeeded too long, and in doing so, it is transformed from a tactic into a constraint. The structural shift does not remain external for long. Once lying becomes something that must be maintained rather than deployed, attention turns inward. Pinocchio begins to watch himself. This is not yet moral reflection, it is self-observation. He notices patterns, how quickly explanations form, how instinctively language appears when pressure rises. The gap between impulse and action, previously unnoticed, becomes visible. Earlier, speech flowed outward without resistance. Now it is intercepted internally. A second position appears, one that monitors, evaluates, and occasionally hesitates. Pinocchio becomes divided. This division is not experienced as corruption, it is experienced as awareness. The realization that behavior is not automatic, that it can be adjusted, withheld, or redirected. With this realization, a previously unused capacity enters consciousness. The capacity to misrepresent deliberately, to conceal, to allow misunderstanding to persist. These capacities were always present, they simply had no reason to surface. Under earlier conditions, transparency felt natural. Once strategy becomes necessary, transparency becomes optional. What changes is not behavior alone, but self-image. Pinocchio now knows what he is doing, even when he continues doing it. That knowledge alters the experience of action. Lying no longer feels playful, it feels intentional. Each choice carries awareness of alternatives that were not taken. This awareness introduces friction. Speech no longer feels light. Silence becomes noticeable. Each interaction requires a small internal check. What to say, what not to say. What might be inferred either way. The mind becomes an observer of its own behavior. This produces a subtle psychological cost. Innocence, when it functions as a strategy, allows the self to remain uncomplicated. When strategy replaces innocence, identity becomes layered. Behavior must be managed alongside intention. Pinocchio does not feel clearer, he feels heavier. The world is no longer the only source of uncertainty. Part of that uncertainty now resides within him. He no longer fully trusts his first impulse. He questions his motivations. He notices the distance between what he experiences internally and what he presents externally. This distance cannot be undone once recognized. The cost is not shame, it is tension. The strategy protects him from immediate consequence, but it burdens him with awareness. The simplicity of acting without reflection is lost. Each choice feels slower, not because it is harder, but because it must pass through observation. The forest of uncertainty is no longer only outside. It has been internalized. Once awareness takes hold, values can no longer remain abstract. They are forced into contact with consequence. Until this point, honesty and deception have functioned primarily as strategies. They were evaluated by what they produced in the moment. But once lying becomes structural and awareness turns inward, the question shifts. It is no longer only what works, it becomes what can be sustained. Truth re-enters the story here, not as a command, but as a cost-bearing choice. Pinocchio begins to recognize that honesty does not simply describe reality, it commits him to it. Truth fixes positions, it closes off alternatives, it creates continuity between past and future statements. What is said cannot be easily revised without consequence. This is where values separate from comfort. Under earlier conditions, honesty appeared virtuous because it carried little risk. It aligned easily with safety, approval, and clarity. Under pressure, that alignment dissolves. Truth no longer guarantees relief, it often accelerates consequence. The value remains, the protection disappears. This is not a moral failure, it is a test. Values that survive only under favorable conditions are not disproven when those conditions vanish. They are revealed. Their limits become visible. Honesty in this environment is no longer an identity, it becomes a position one must occupy deliberately. Pinocchio feels this tension internally. Telling the truth now means accepting restriction. It means surrendering flexibility. It means allowing outcomes to solidify rather than remain negotiable. Lying, by contrast, still offers expansion. It keeps options open. But it does so at increasing psychological and structural cost. Values no longer divide cleanly into good and bad. They divide into sustainable and unsustainable. This is destabilizing. Pinocchio does not replace one moral code with another. Instead, coherence fractures. Some values are retained despite their cost. Others are modified not because they were wrong, but because they demanded more than the situation allowed. The self becomes a site of negotiation. What emerges is not moral clarity, but moral pressure. Each choice exposes what Pinocchio is willing to pay for consistency. Each decision carries weight, not because it is judged, but because it persists. Values no longer float above circumstance. They are embedded within it. The story does not resolve this tension. It leaves it intact. There is no hierarchy where strength replaces innocence or calculation replaces sincerity. There is only the recognition that ideals behave differently when protection is removed. Truth here is no longer a virtue in the abstract. It is a constraint one chooses or does not. And that choice is never neutral. After the strategic and internal shifts have taken place, the story no longer advances along a single, moralized path. It becomes conditional. Events depend less on what the characters represent and more on how they respond to uncertainty. Pinocchio still moves through the world. He still speaks. Situations still arise that demand explanation or response. What has changed is the texture of those moments. Fewer interactions feel spontaneous, more feel measured. Speech is no longer an automatic response to pressure. It is delayed, evaluated, sometimes withheld. Silence begins to carry meaning, not as resistance or defiance, but as restraint. What is not said now shapes outcomes as much as what is. The story no longer progresses through dramatic confrontation or correction. It progresses through omission and timing, through moments where something that once would have been explained is allowed to remain unresolved. This does not create safety, it creates volatility. Without full disclosure, others must infer. Without clarity, assumptions fill the space. The environment becomes less predictable, not more, but it also becomes less easily exploited. Advantage is harder to extract when information is incomplete. Pinocchio's behavior appears calmer from the outside. There is less visible conflict, fewer immediate consequences. But this calm is maintained through attention. It requires constant awareness of what has been said before and what might follow now. The story becomes procedural. There is no single moment where innocence clearly fails or where strategy is decisively rewarded. Instead, there is a sequence of small adjustments, Each one carries minor consequences that accumulate over time. If Pinocchio succeeds in avoiding harm, it does not feel like a moral victory. It feels circumstantial, dependent on timing, restraint, and the limits of others' patience. If he fails, it is not framed as punishment. It is understood as miscalculation. The absence of moral clarity alters how outcomes are experienced. Relief, when it appears, is quiet. Loss, when it occurs, is less instructive. The story no longer teaches, it records. What remains is not resolution, but balance temporarily restored, a balance that is understood to be unstable. The world has not become fairer, it has become more exacting. By the end of this version of the story, nothing definitive has been proven. Lying has not been condemned outright. Truth has not been redeemed as a universal solution. What has changed is not the rule, but the understanding of what rules do when they are applied repeatedly over time. Pinocchio does not emerge wiser in a triumphant sense. He does not arrive at honesty through revelation or moral awakening. He arrives at awareness through accumulation, through the recognition that certain strategies become too costly to maintain, not because they are wrong, but because they demand constant attention. What the story ultimately observes is not morality, but load. Language carries weight, not immediately, but cumulatively. Each use commits the speaker to a future shape. Words do not disappear once spoken. They remain available to memory, to pattern, to expectation. In this light, truth is not an ideal. It is a boundary, a way of limiting future complexity by accepting present constraint. It closes options, but it also prevents further narrowing. It does not liberate, it stabilizes. Lying, by contrast, is not framed as corruption. It is framed as expansion without structure. It opens possibilities without accounting for accumulation. It feels liberating until it requires continuous management. The story does not suggest that one should always tell the truth. It shows why, at a certain point, not telling it becomes unsustainable. Not because of virtue, because of weight. What ultimately changes is Pinocchio's relationship to himself. Earlier, identity was fluid. Speech could be revised, actions dissolved after the moment passed. There was little continuity between who he was now and who he had been before. That state cannot survive awareness. Once Pinocchio understands that language leaves residue, identity begins to harden. Not into rigidity, but into continuity. Past statements begin to matter. Earlier choices shape later credibility. The self becomes something that persists. Innocence, in this sense, is not lost through corruption. It is lost through precision. Precision requires acknowledgement. It requires accepting that one remains the same actor across time, accountable not only for intention, but for pattern. This is heavier than guilt. Guilt can be localized, pattern cannot. Pinocchio does not become morally superior, he becomes more legible. That legibility carries discomfort. Silence becomes conspicuous, speech becomes binding. Each choice narrows future options slightly, even when chosen freely. This is the quiet cost of coherence. The story ends without restoring simplicity. The world does not become safer, strategy does not disappear, but expectations change. Pinocchio no longer assumes that language will erase consequence. He no longer treats flexibility as protection. He understands that freedom is not the absence of constraint, but the ability to choose which constraints to accept. What remains is not purity, it is precision. And precision, once acquired, cannot be undone. The tale concludes without offering instruction. It does not teach how to speak or when to remain silent. It only shows how strategies shape environments and how environments apply pressure back. The path still exists, the future remains open, but it is no longer undefined. Until the next observation.